On the 12th of September 1897, one of the most heroic last stands ever fought occurred on the northwest frontier of India, when 21 Sikh soldiers of the British Indian Army took on over 10,000 Afghan tribesmen. The story of heroism, comradeship and bloody-mindedness is a tale that's both inspirational and breathtaking. This is the story of the last stand at the Battle of Saragarhi. The Sikhs have a long tradition of valour in battle, whether it's establishing their own empire, reaching out from the Punjab in northern India, to fighting the British, to fighting for the British, or fighting for the Republic of India. This story, however, is set in the days of the British Raj. The Battle of Saragarhi was fought in the northwest frontier region of British India in 1897. The northwest frontier was divided into a so-called settled area that came under direct British rule and a largely autonomous tribal area directly adjacent to the Afghan border. And this latter zone was free from the trappings of colonial rule such as courts, police and taxation. In 1893, a border between British India and Afghanistan was formalised, but swiftly the Emir of Afghanistan repudiated the agreement, claiming parts of the province as his own, as indeed of course they had been prior to being conquered by the Sikhs in the past. With the British defeating the Sikhs in the 1840s, these areas on the northwest frontier had de facto fallen under British control. The problem was that this Afghan British Indian frontier ran straight through the tribal lands of the Pathan people, the largest ethnic group in modern-day Afghanistan and in the north of Pakistan. The Pathans, also called the Pashtuns, were divided into some 60 tribes, and whilst linguistically and culturally related, they all had their own agendas and inter-tribal bloody feuds. However, just like a family that has internal feuds, woe betide an outsider who tries to come in between them. And enter the British. And whilst the British and the Emir might have agreed on a border, the local Pathan people didn't see the demarcation. And consequently, adding this geographically wild and isolated part of the world to the empire proved a mixed blessing for the British. It was one of those political decisions that was felt necessary not for the land or for its wealth, but to thwart Russian ambitions in the region, or at least that was their perception. And it wasn't completely wacky. For the previous 50 years, Britain had watched nervously as the Russians had extended their empire southwards through Muslim Central Asia, places like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, coming right to the northern borders of Afghanistan, perilously close to India itself, the jewel in Britain's imperial crown. In the 1890s, tensions in the northwest frontier were rising. One reason was a fear by the Pathan people that there was going to be outright annexation by the British of those tribal autonomous areas. But like a lot of events in history, it's a little bit more complicated than that. For instance, in 1897, nearly 3,000 miles to the west, the Turks had defeated the Greeks in a war. And this victory for the ailing Ottoman Empire had electrified Muslims across Asia. Here was proof that the armies of Islam could defeat European Christians, like Great Britain for instance. The Emir of Afghanistan chose this moment to write a religious book that, despite his protestations, could certainly be considered a call for holy war against the Christians. In the summer of 1897, one tribe after another from the Pathan region of northwest frontier of India rose in rebellion, and many of their families from across the border in Afghanistan joined them. In late August, shots were fired at the British garrison at Fort Lockhart, and then 4,000 tribesmen surrounded Fort Gulistan, both in the Samana range. These two forts had been established by the British to try and keep some sort of control in this area of the northwest frontier. Gulistan to the west, slightly more vulnerable and exposed, and Fort Lockhart to the east. However, the landscape between the two forts prevented a clear line of sight, which meant they couldn't communicate to each other in times of trouble. And so a communication outpost was established halfway between them at Saragarhi. Unlike Fort Gulistan and Fort Lockhart, this was never intended to be a defensible fort, consisting purely of a small blockhouse with the loopholed ramparts and a signalling tower. from where a heliograph could relay messages between the two forts. The two forts, plus the communication post, were garrisoned by men of the 36th Sikh Bengal Infantry, part of the British Indian Army, under Lieutenant Colonel Houghton. Houghton himself was based at Fort Lockhart to the east with about 170 men, whilst 180 men were stationed at Fort Gullistan to the west. And meanwhile, a tiny force of just 21, 18 sepoys or privates, and 3 Sikh NCOs were left at the communication post at Saragarhi. During the 2 weeks preceding our story, Colonel Houghton had twice had to sally out to drive off thousands of tribesmen menacing Fort Gullistan in the west. But on the 12th of September, the Pathan or Afghan tribesmen turned their attention to the tiny communication post that was the linchpin between telling each fort when they were in trouble and getting reinforcements. The Battle of Saragarhi was about to commence. Early morning on the 12th of September 1897, Havildar Ishar Singh, the NCO commanding the 21-man garrison at Saragarhi, peered through his binoculars and was greeted by an awesome sight. Column upon column of Pathan tribesmen advancing on his outpost. And as he watched, even more columns joined their host, their battle standards blowing in the wind like some giant medieval army. Havildar, which is the rank of sergeant, Ishar Singh, was in his 40s and had joined the army when he was 18, so we're talking about an experienced soldier here. He had been in the 36th Sikh Bengal Infantry ever since its inception, 10 years beforehand in 1887. With a rebellious streak, he often crossed swords with his officers, but that same rebellious nature made him hugely respected by his men, whom he in turn looked out for. Apart from his very obvious military experience, he was renowned as the regiment's producer of illicit liquor, and for his ability to borrow, in inverted commas, meat from neighbouring units whenever he felt his own men's rations were in short supply. As Major James Lunt said of him afterwards, Ishar Singh was somewhat of a turbulent character whose independent nature brought him more than once in front of his military superiors. But he also added, Ishar Singh, in camp a nuisance, in field magnificent. And it was this rebellious, magnificent, don't tell me what to do attitude that he was about to display on the 12th of September 1897. Over in Fort Lockhart, Colonel Houghton received a message from the heliograph at Saragarhi. Enemy approaching main gate. Need reinforcements. And as he looked through his binoculars, the colonel could see 14 tribal battle standards marching towards the little fort. And he estimated that probably represented somewhere between 10 and 14,000 tribesmen marching on his little unit of 21 men. But Houghton and his garrison of 170 odd men had their own problems. Thousands more Pathan tribesmen were assembling between his fort and Saragarhi, blocking any relief. At around 9:30, the Pathan or Afghan army paused in front of the tiny communication post and requested that the 21 Sikh soldiers surrender. And really, it was no contest. 21 men versus, well, probably about 12,000, a ratio of 500 to 1. Now, if you consider that the garrison at Rorke's Drift during the Zulu Wars were outnumbered 40 to 1, and that the defenders of the Alamo were outnumbered something like 25 to 1, you can see just how hopeless the situation was for the men at Saragarhi, and how heroic their next action was. I said earlier that Havildar Ishar Singh was respected by his men and he looked out for his men. And at this moment, with the summons to surrender, he consulted them. Did they want to surrender or face certain annihilation? Meanwhile, the heliograph operator on top of the tower, Gurmukh Singh, received a message from Fort Lockhart. Unable to break through, hold position. Havildar Ishar Singh and his men were on their own, and they signalled back, understood. Having had their consultation, Ishar Singh defiantly delivered their verdict to the tribesmen. There'd be no surrender. He formed his men into 2 lines in front of the fort, and as the Pathans charged, he opened fire at 250 metres. Deadly .303 calibre rifles fired at such close range had a devastating effect on the attackers. But the numbers were on the Pathans' side, and their charge continued, and they started to return fire. Sepoy Bhagwan Singh was the first of the British soldiers to be killed. His body was carried back into the compound by Corporal Lal Singh, who himself had been badly injured, and as they got through the gate was slammed against the tribesmen. The Pathans made two more determined efforts on the main gate, but they were beaten back both times by the Sikhs. Up on the tower, 19-year-old Gurmukh Singh continued to send messages to their commanding officer, Colonel Houghton, at Fort Lockhart. Gurmukh Singh was the youngest of the 21-man garrison, and he was to play a key role in this historic story. By staying at his post and constantly sending messages, the garrison at Fort Lockhart were given a running commentary of events as they were unfolding. It was almost a 21st century social media commentary using 19th century heliograph. And it's thanks to his efforts that the brave story of these 21 defenders was able to be accurately recorded. The Afghans continued to attack the outpost. Colonel Houghton took 50 men out of Fort Lockhart to try and create a diversion to pull some of the attackers away from Saragarhi, but to no effect. By midday, the Sikh soldiers had held off 7 attacks, but they were now down to just 10 men. Up on the tower, teenage Gurmukh Singh urgently signalled with the heliograph, "Low on ammo, need ammo urgently." Colonel Houghton was in a dilemma. What should he do? Even if he left his own fort totally unguarded and took all 170 men towards Saragarhi, what effect would that actually have against an enemy force of around 12,000 men? I mean, true, he'd reduced the odds to about 60 to 1, which is better than 500 to 1, but that's still a far worse ratio than the defenders of Rorke's Drift or the Alamo had to endure. And don't forget, the enemy had completely ignored his last effort to try and bring relief earlier that morning. In desperation, he decided on a new tactic. Maybe just one man could sneak through the Pathan lines and take ammunition into the little compound. And so he sent his personal orderly on a daring and highly dangerous mission. But it was not to be. The orderly was spotted and chased by the attackers all the way back to Fort Lockhart. By now, the Afghans were trying to scale the walls, and Havildar Ishar Singh's men were involved in fierce hand-to-hand combat. And whilst they were engaged in this fight for their lives, the Sikhs didn't spot a small party of the enemy warriors running into a blind spot underneath one of the corners of the outpost, where they started to try and chip away at the brick wall to try and create a breach. The Afghan attackers now set fire to the bushes in front of the communication post, effectively creating a smokescreen. And for the first time that day, the British Indian soldiers could not see their enemy advancing. Using the cover of the smoke, 2 Afghans now rushed forward to that corner that they'd been trying to dislodge the bricks and placed explosives at the base. And at around 3:30, the ensuing explosion finally resulted in the corner of the outpost collapsing. Now the Afghans got ready to launch a 2-pronged attack on the main gate and that breached corner. Just 2 miles away in Fort Lockhart, their fellow members of the 36th Sikh Regiment saw what was about to happen and sent a desperate message on their heliograph: "Enemy approaching the breach." But what was the tiny garrison to do? Because at that very minute, the main gate finally gave way, and the Afghans swarmed into the tiny fort. It was at this moment that Havildar Ishar Singh, who was already severely wounded from both gunshots and sword cuts, ordered his remaining men to fall back into the courtyard while he personally covered them. And then, fixing his bayonet, he and 2 sepoys charged the advancing Pathans. Their attack caught the Afghans by surprise, and briefly they fell back under the sudden and brave attack before surrounding Ishar Singh and his companions. The 3 brave Sikhs of the 36th disappeared into a mass of Pathan tribesmen. 5 Sikh soldiers now found themselves in the courtyard facing the enemy host. Forming a circle, they fought back to back with their bayonets. And meanwhile, up at the top of the tower, young Gurmukh Singh watched the final death throes of his unit, and he sent a last signal to Fort Lockhart. Main gate breached. Down to 1. Request permission to dismount and join the fight. Across the 2 miles of the Samana range came his commanding officer's reply. Permission granted. Reports from Pathans who were at the battle later recounted that Gurmukh Singh, the last of the Saragarhi garrison, bolted the door of the tower and killed 20 attackers before the Afghans set the tower ablaze. According to those same reports, he was still firing and shouting defiantly as he died in the flames. The Pathan victory at Saragarhi was a Pyrrhic victory. The 8 hours they'd spent trying to take on 21 men had bought the British garrisons in both forts valuable time. And once they'd finally taken out Havildar Ishar Singh's men, they moved on to Fort Gulistan. But they were now prepared, and they were able to hold out until a relief force of 2,000 men from the Royal Irish, the Gurkhas and the Punjab infantry arrived on the scene 2 days later and drove the Pathan forces away from Fort Gulistan and off the Samana range. When the relief force arrived at the burnt-out remains of Saragarhi, they counted over 200 dead Afghans lying around the post. Pathan leaders themselves claimed that they'd lost about 180 men killed and many, many more wounded. The figure that's generally given, for instance in the 1987 book Saragarhi Battalion, is that the Pathans lost about 450 men killed and wounded, which would sort of correlate with the Pathan figures, and indeed with the observations of the relief column arriving to see 200 dead outside the fort. 450 men killed or wounded by 21 defenders. That meant each defender took out 20 enemy warriors. That ratio is far higher than Rorke's Drift or the Alamo or the defeats at the Little Big Horn or Isandlwana. And as they searched the burned out remains, they uncovered the charred bodies of the defenders. And amidst the debris, they found the heliograph. It had been packed away in its leather case. Yeah, amazingly, young Gurmukh Singh, when he was given permission to dismount and fight his attackers, had first taken the time to carefully pack the heliograph away. How is that for professionalism and coolness? The war on the northwest frontier continued into the following year with the Tirah campaign and also the Malakand field force, whose exploits were published in a book by one of its young officers, a person who's appeared in some of my Boer War videos and my story on the Battle of Omdurman, one Winston Churchill. He gets everywhere, doesn't he? But that's got to be the story for another video. Those campaigns restored British order to the frontier region of British India, but it remained a volatile part of the British Empire right up until the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947. The defence of Saragarhi was, as far as military battles are concerned, pretty small. Its strategic importance was minimal too, apart from buying time for Fort Gulistan. But the heroism and devotion to duty is what makes it stand out, along with the significant casualties they inflicted. Overwhelmingly outnumbered, but refusing to surrender, Havildar Ishar Singh and his 20 men fought to the last bullet and the last man, and they made their enemy pay dearly. When reports of the Battle of Saragarhi reached London, the British Parliament rose to pay their respects. Let me just pause there. This is at the height of Queen Victoria's empire. The white men in the British Parliament rose to pay their respects and honour the Indians who'd fought for them at Saragarhi. All 21 defenders were awarded the Indian Order of Merit, at the time the highest medal for gallantry available to Indian troops. It was the only time that award was ever given to all the men in a particular battle. An obelisk was erected to their memory at Fort Lockhart, which is still there to this day. And 3 gurdwaras were built in their memory, one of which is close to the Golden Temple in Amritsar. The heroic story continues to be remembered to this day. In 2019, a Bollywood film, Kesarai, recalled the battle in true Bollywood fashion. The 36th Sikh Bengal Infantry became the 36th Sikh Infantry just a few years later, and then served with distinction on the Western Front during the First World War. Through various amalgamations and renames, their descendants are the 4th Battalion Sikh Regiment in the modern Indian Army. And members of Britain's Sikh community continue to serve in the British Armed Forces too, which, since 2013, have commemorated the Battle of Saragarhi as a Battle Honour Day. The story of Saragarhi might not be as famous as some other last stands, but I think it definitely deserves to be. It's a story not just of heroism against overwhelming odds, but of dedication to duty, a willingness to take the hard road rather than the easy option, and also a willingness to stick by those around you, your comrades. That's a story that goes throughout military history, and it's a story my uncle told me about his fighting in Normandy in 1944. Recently I visited the West Midlands town of Wednesfield near Wolverhampton. Here a local Sikh community-led initiative raised nearly £100,000 to erect a statue to honour the defenders of Saragarhi. The 10-foot statue of Havildar Ishar Singh with his sword was unveiled in 2021, and it is an impressive statue. Beneath are the names of all 21 men who died in that last stand. I think it's a fitting tribute that shows that over 120 years after the event, these soldiers can still act as an inspiration, even for communities in totally different continents. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. There's plenty more stories coming your way, so please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any of them. In the meantime, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.